So this talk is really inspired by like some interviews, experiences I've had recently where people are interviewing for roles, and usually a question comes up is build something, right? Like build some component or whatever. And I see a lot of people writing class components, and I just think you can get the job done a lot faster with hooks. So I'm just trying to get the basic building block hooks out of the way, and maybe get y'all. Sounds like everybody here is used to it. So anyway, also, man, that Wix, that's pretty futuristic stuff, man. The future is the light theme again. That's kind of cool. But anyway, all right, let's get to it. So yeah, basically, there's a few hooks that I just use all the time. useReducer, useState, and useEffect, and optionally, for a little bit of performance, useCallback and useMemo. So those are basically the building blocks. You get those down, you're gonna, really gonna want to use class components anymore after that. And especially when we get into useEffect, Dan Abramoff wrote this big long blog post on useEffect and how there's gotchas with class components, especially with state and caching and whatnot. So anyway, all right. So I built a quick and dirty demo app. It was inspired by like some interview scenarios I've seen where like, hey, use Star Wars API to build blah, 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 and whatever. So I'll just show that to you right now just to kind of make it less boring. Yeah, so basically the idea is that, you got a bunch of Star Wars characters and I mashed it up with TMDB so I can get some images because Star Wars API itself is just text. And you got to make a lot of calls to get all the fields you need, like the species and whatnot. So I try to make it seem like, like sort of like a dating website or something. I don't know. But yeah, so the idea is that you have a list of persons or characters, and then you can click on that person and see what movies are in, basically. And then for a bonus, I added some autocomplete. Yeah. Get right to yeah, but don't worry. The fun part is actually in the code. So, and where I work, and probably where a lot of you are planning on working, we do a lot of ad hoc stuff with ad hoc type systems like TypeScript. But I digress. So, all right. So yeah, we just went over the features. Yeah. All right. Bootstrapping. So I like to use the useReducer. I just kind of like my application state centralized where possible. But I mean, there's a lot of dope options. Like you can use useState, and you can push your state management all over the place. And there's that immer, so you can even write like imperative style code. So it's kind of cool. There's a lot of options now. So yeah, basically what it looks like is you have an initial state. You have this reducer function, takes a state and an action, pretty similar if you use Redux. Then you have to sort of bootstrap your state, right? So basically what we have in the application was that we have this characters list and a films list. The characters have a list of films, so that's how I can go to the films list and filter out what films each character's in. So, and then there's basically just a couple of actions, right? So you've got a view, you've got this initial set movie data, which is that's the API fetch. So, and it's kind of important when we get into useEffect, why you want to do that in one big blast. All right, so, all right. Anyway, here's the example from the website. You have your state dispatch as a return values, and your useReducer takes your reducer function and an initial state. And then this is just taken straight from the documentation. The actions are just sort of a convention. There's usually a type and a payload coming from the Redux side of things. And then also the reducer function takes a state object and action object and returns a state. That's the reducer function signature. It's kind of like Haskell notation. And it returns a pair, state and dispatch function. The dispatch function takes action and is void.
Sorry to interrupt. Can you talk a little more in the microphone?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so, all right. And then just by contrast, useState, you're going to get a state object, you're going to get a setter. So it's kind of up to you to manage when to call that set state and how you modify that state object that you're passing into set state. I wonder which microphone it actually is. Anyway. All right. Yeah, so again, this is just from the documentation. The initial render is going to take whatever argument you pass into useState. And then when you call set state again, it's going to trigger another re-render. Very much similar to Redux. All right, so those are the two state management hooks. That's pretty much your only options. But at least you have two instead of just set state in class components. So, all right, useEffect is a little bit more complicated, but basically what happens is it's called after your component mounts. So that means that your component returns the value, it's rendered, it's inserted into the DOM, boom, your function is called. You really don't want to modify the state until that guy is done because it's going to force another re-render. And you could possibly lose whatever was happening in this function. So basically, in this example, you can see that Dan has this returns a cleanup function. So optionally, before useEffect is called, if you provide a list of props or dependencies, if those dependencies change, the component re-renders, remounted, it's called again. But before it's called again, you can give it a cleanup function to do any cleanup work. So it's kind of like component will unmount or something like that, and component did mount all in one. So it's in a way it's a lot more versatile and a lot less boilerplatey. Oh, great. Okay, cool. All right. So yeah, basically this is where you want to do all your fetch API. Okay. And the whole idea is that you do your side effecting stuff in useEffect. And it's kind of got like some computer science, algebraic effects theory behind it all. Right, yeah, so this is straight from the documentation, accepts function, accepts an array of dependencies, can return a cleanup handler. useEffect in practice, similar to component did mount. It's a good place for your API calls. It's a good place to do effectful things after a component is mounted. So like if you want to go get your ref or do stuff on the DOM, things like that, it's a really good place to make that happen. So you don't have to worry too much now about, component will mount, component will receive props, component, all that kind of stuff. You can just kind of do it all in useEffect. So that's really the workhorse of function components. In my demo app, this is where actually I do my data loading. And so you can see here, all I'm looking to do is see if I have a loaded status, and I don't even have a loading indicator. But anyway, yeah. So there's this function that I import called load API, and it takes this TMDB API key and does a whole bunch of data munging and stuff that I wasted way too much time on. And then returns an action, and then I just call dispatch on that action. So another thing I like to do is I kind of like to keep dispatch in the top level component. But that's just a preference thing. All right. So, yeah, let's take a look at the code real quick. So here's my top level component. It's called app.js. And
Are you able to zoom in a little bit,
yeah, you bet.
please?
How's that? Let me get rid of this. All right. Yeah, so here's my reducer. We went over that. And man, it's hard to hold this mic and then Apple F. All right, yeah, so here's useEffect. And you can see that there's basically these two props. Status, which is coming from state. It doesn't matter if if it's a derivative of a prop or if it's actually a prop in your component. It's just a dependency that React can track the change to, and it'll call this component again. All right, so cool, man. We're almost done here. Okay, yeah, so useCallback, it's really cool. It's kind of a undervalued team player, but I use it pretty frequently to render components. Like you have a function that returns a component. Unless your props change, it just keeps it around. You don't have to worry about, any extra, allocations or anything like that. It just creates a closure and calls it, or a thunk, as we used to call it. Anyway, so yeah, you pass an inline callback and array of dependencies. Callback is memoized. That's a fun interview question people like to ask. So, yeah. So here's what it looks like in the demo app. I have this component called card list and card item. I'm not real great at naming, so let's go into that. So here in card list, see I'm importing useCallback, and I just use it basically to render a component. I tried to simplify it here in this example. Yeah, so basically it just returns this detail card, and which is basically the item. useMemo is very similar to useCallback, but it's for values, not for functions. So you have some value you need to use, and in my app, I basically use it if I can't find the profile image or something for an actor, then I return back this other component, which is font awesome, and it basically just caches that value, and then you could just insert it. There's really no need to call any function or anything like that because you either have a photo or you don't, right? So, right. Yep, so just made a note here. Check out the docs. They're actually pretty good. Another thing that I didn't really use, but is pretty helpful, like in making the migration from class components to function components, is useRef. useRef can be used as a prop. You can pass to your DOM nodes, and it gives you a reference to the actual underlying DOM, or you can use it like a private member that you used to use in your class components. So it's kind of got dual purpose. There's another one too called useImperativeHandle, but now we're kind of getting into the weeds, the not so commonly used hooks. But this is pretty cool because it's a way to, like if you have an API that you want to expose imperatively, like let's say that you're inserting things in the DOM and you need to wait for the DOM to finish rendering it and you need to check the size of it or something like that. Maybe you're building a charting library or whatever, and you need to like provide like some, like maybe a focus or some sort of like method that you can call. You can use ImperativeHandle to return back that closure to, or object that basically that exposes the API to a client. Probably not something you would see in an interview scenario, but. And then there's useLayoutEffect. It's similar to useEffect, but it's guaranteed to be fired after all the DOM mutations have happened. So if you're mutating the DOM and you need to be called again to know that those DOM mutations happen, that's pretty handy, but again, it's kind of an edge case. All right, so yeah, that's about it. We scratched the surface. I put the demo app on GitHub, and you can create your own demo apps, extend it. I put some resources here. It's actually this whole presentation is in the same GitHub repository. It's using this cool thing called MDX. So it's pretty neat. And then there's some pretty cool other videos like on YouTube where Ryan Florence and Michael Jackson, they actually build React hooks implementation from scratch. Then Ryan Florence gave a talk at the React Conf, 90% cleaner code with hooks. Then there's this really cool GitHub repository called Awesome React Hooks. And I mean, like, it has just got like a ton of like, it's crazy. Pretty dope. Man. Okay, great. Oh yeah, right. Tab, right? Let's see what happens. Okay, this one. Dang it. And just like that, my presentation's gone.
Were you on the website? Backspace?
Oh, yeah, right. That's probably what it was, right? Yeah. Target new. Yep, thanks. I forgot how to use that browser, man. Code? Cool. Browser use? I don't know, man. Anyway, yeah, and also had some nits. You know, like the problem maybe with the demo app is that I didn't add a clear button. You know, it kind of looks like crap. There's only 4 columns, and I could add a lot of critiques and make myself cry in front of you guys, but that's cool. I won't do that. Also, some cool things to maybe check out is suspense loading. React Spring is a really cool way to like add animations and kind of pizzazz. It's just low-hanging fruit, you know? Like if you get one of these take-home projects or something like, you know, like play around with it, get familiar with it, and you can be like, oh, you know, throw that in there and impress your interviewer, I guess. Yeah. Some other cool things, I guess, you know, GQL is supposed to be the new hotness. And then Gatsby, SSR, all that stuff is pretty cool. And that's it. Yeah. I'm on Twitter, so hit me up. Thanks.
So now I know there's going to be questions. Yeah.
Hi, Joe. So I have actually 2 questions. The first one is about useMemo. So I play a lot with hooks, but I never went deep into all those, the rest that you talk about, especially because I use Redux. But what about useMemo? So that would be like the same as having a function that returns, that calculates what if the value exists or not and returns either or, would be like a ternary operator?
It's just like useCallback. Basically, you give it a dependency list, right? And so it's a dependency list that React is keeping track of, right? So if it's kind of like a way of like, think of it like re-rendering, right? Like your component may need, or your function may need to be called again with a whole new set of values, right? And then those are just enclosed. So it's just a thunk, basically. It's a function that's sitting around waiting to be applied with some enclosed values. But useMemo is just for values, like a variable, you know, like a number or an object or something like that. But useCallback will return a function that you can apply later.
Okay.
So that's the
And
difference.
that function will render an element, HTML element, right?
It doesn't have to. And I mean, that's just a good use case for it, right? Like, I mean, you could use it, hey, you know, like if you're calculating Fibonacci or something like that, right? Like, you know, it's just like any other function where you would want to memoize your dependencies.
Mm-hmm. And sorry, one more question about useRef. So that would be ways of accessing the DOM outside of the React code. What ways would you access the DOM code that is not available inside the React code?
Yeah, great question. So one of the hooks I actually didn't talk about, and I kind of like skated past it, but use context. So like you could use context to inject anything from any external piece into your React tree, if you will, right? So, or your React graph, I don't know, whatever they call it. So,
Okay,
Yeah.
no more questions.
Okay, I got another question here.
So I haven't really used like hooks at all. Is there a difference in mindset when you're programming, like using class? Like what I do is if I'm not using state, I'm using a functional component. But now you're basically saying with a functional component, you could use state. So what's the paradigm shift in the way you think to use hooks?
yeah. So the 2 big things are the lifecycle methods and the private, like your instance variables, right, for your class components. But those instance variables, like, they can also get you into trouble. So it's kind of nice to steer you away from using that too much. You can get what they call a stale closure, right? So like you can, let's say that, for example, you want to set state and you want to base it on some value that you had, but that value may have gone stale, and maybe it was actually based on state, and you might need to, change your set state to a function where it passes in the old state, so that way you get the latest, things like that. So like there's little gotchas with class components, and also it's just more boilerplate, right? So like that's the idea here, really. It's just, but yeah, the big thing is that those lifecycle methods have gone away with useEffect, right? useEffect is like blows out all those lifecycle methods, and then you've got your useReducer and useState to do your state management. So the big shift is that you have to think about, oh, when is my hook going to be called, right? Or when do I call set state? Or what happens when I call set state? That's going to cause it's going to trigger what they call a commit, which then triggers a reapplication of your function, which then impacts the DOM, and so on and so forth.
More questions?
Okay, so if we're using in a class component, if we have component amount, component update, component will amount, all this lifecycle methods inside a class component. If we do want to use the same inside a hook, inside a function component, we have to instantiate different use effects, or is there a way of calling different lifecycle methods inside the same use effect?
That's an awesome question. Yeah, so you can use as many hooks as you want in your function component, which is like, that's pretty cool. Like, so yeah, you can use as many use callbacks, you can have as many use effects, and each use effect, when you declare your dependencies, like, hey, for example, let's say that I wanted to like make a remote call after rendering the list of movies. Like maybe, hey, I want to get maybe movie times or something like that, right? Then I would add a use effect maybe in the component, like to say, go get me this list of movie times for this particular movie title, right? But then, so like title would be the prop that I would be depending on. But then there might also be something like, oh, maybe I need to go into the DOM and like do some selector and then like apply some CSS class or do something programmatically, right? And I could put a different different use effect, because now I know that the thing's been mounted, and I could go ahead and then use my ref or whatever and then go ahead and make my DOM options. And I know that that use effect won't get called again, because unless the dependency, like that ref, changes, which you shouldn't, or, well, you wouldn't, actually you can't really use refs as dependency, I'm sorry. But like, whatever, you got some prop or whatever, like maybe that's coming from your state, and then you could go ahead and do a separate use effect there. So you can change, so you can have as many, like, it's kind of like you could stack all your imperative calls in your lifecycle method, but now you're just breaking it up into a different use effect implementation with a different set of dependencies. You just have to think about that differently. So that's the tricky part, I guess.
Is there any hook that simulates so I actually learned yesterday more about the React Pure component, how to actually use it, and
right,
why people use it. But I realized that that's something that you use for a class component. Is there something that simulates that in a functional component?
Yeah, probably the closest thing would be useMemo, right? Because useMemo, you're going to give it dependencies, and now your component is going to be, or your function is going to be cached until those dependencies change. So useMemo is probably or again, useCallback, because any JSX tag is just a function, right? So if you want to use it like in JSX, you would use useCallback, but if you just want to like render it in line, you would then put that useMemo in brackets and just evaluate it.
Maybe 1.5 more questions. Okay. Okay. I have a quick question. So quick question from here. So for the people that are looking for jobs, that are going in these interviews, and maybe you don't know the answer necessarily, is there a shift to using these hooks more in interviews?
No, not really. I mean, because the problem is that, let's say you're interviewing for a React job, and it's like, I've been, working in this old code base that's got class components, and that's just what I'm used to looking at. But it's killing you on the interview, man, because it's taking so long with all that boilerplate. You know what I'm saying? So like, and it's not that, yeah, it's a little bit of a shift. You have to, there's some things to get used to, but But I guarantee you, man, like it reduces, and React is already like, that's one of my main gripes with it is that, it's just a lot of boilerplate. Although, shout out to Wix, man, because like you guys were one of the first, React adopters, right? So like, but yeah, no, I mean like it is a lot of, but it's getting a lot less. And that's the whole idea is that, there's less boilerplate, less things to like keep track of in your head. And the cool thing about it, especially like we're using useCallback or useMemo or things like that, it's just based on like sound computer science principles, right? Like there's referential transparency, it's just a pure function, yada, yada. So like, you're letting the algebraic effect system do all of the, I don't want to say non-deterministic, but all of the, shady stuff. All of the stuff that's hard to reason about. Go ahead.
So my half question. Just to clarify, with useEffect, it replaces at least two lifecycle methods, right? One is component did mount and component did update.
Yeah.
So if you don't pass in a value to watch, then that's like component did update, did mount.
I think the two that it really replaces is like component did mount, component will unmount, right? Those two guys.
Component will mount.
Will unmount because like
Will unmount.
because you can give it a function to do all your cleanup that you would have done in component will unmount, right? So like if you need to clean something up after your component's ready to be disposed of, that's where you return the function to do all your cleanup in your useEffect.
Okay.
So those are really the two. I mean, like the other thing, like get derived state from props and like component will receive props and all that kind of stuff. Like you don't really have to worry about that with hooks, right? Because you're declaring your dependencies. So you're saying, hey, I depend on these things. Only call me when these things change. So you don't have to do all that derivation.
Right, but if you don't declare a dependency, then it's like component did update.
It's going to
Did
get called.
mount.
Yeah, it's going to get called every single time.
Yeah.
You don't declare. Yeah, I mean, it's just
That's
I
what I
need
just
this
wanted
thing to
to
be, and
clarify.
that's a third use case for useEffect. You want it to get called every time. Don't declare any dependencies. It'll get called.
Got it. Thank you.
Yep.
One half question, if I may. What about performance implications using these hooks versus class components? Any thoughts there?
Well, one big thing that people maybe don't think about so much is bundle size. It should reduce your bundle size, right? And that really actually impacts your performance in a big way, even small changes to your bundle size, because like when you talk about lots and lots of components, it adds up. So.
Last question, if you don't mind.
Yeah, so you mentioned that class-based components have a lot of gotchas, and I've encountered a couple with hooks that I just wanted to ask you how you deal with and keep on top of.
Okay.
One of the things, like with useEffect, if your dependency array contains, let's say, a prop that you're getting that you're only destructuring there. Like if you haven't destructured your prop before you declare it as a dependency, then because of this shallow object equality React stuff, it'll run your hook every time props change at all, not just that particular prop. That's one thing. And if you like integrate, if you use imperative APIs like set timeout or set interval and stuff, you can just totally lose a reference to that event handler, for example.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So that you kind of pointed out something that like is in general just maybe a hard transition for a lot of like imperative developers to make to React or functional declarative style programming, right? Like you want to separate you want to push your side effects to the boundaries of your application. And you definitely, it's not, because it's JavaScript, it's not a type language. And you can even put conditionals around it. So like even if you do use a really solid like type system like Reason or something like that, you're still not going to get 100% like type safety. But anyway, the point is that you have to let React know what you're depending on. But there is that ESLint rule, and I highly recommend just get that ESLint rule. And I'm telling you, man, that thing has saved me so many times because like I don't even really keep track that much of what I'm doing. I just kind of like in the back of my mind, like, oh yeah, React is going to call me if this changes, but I get sloppy like everybody else and get in a hurry, and but then that ESLint's got my back. So, and like Kent Dodds also did a talk he breaks down that whole ESLint rules and like why they're there. That's also worth checking out if you want to go deeper in that.
Cool. Well, thank you, Joe.
Thank you.